There is a sound you never forget once you have heard it. It is not the sound of thunder, though it shakes the earth the same way. It is not the sound of a storm, though it tears trees from their roots with the same casual indifference. It is the sound of a 75mm howitzer shell arriving before you ever hear it leave. First comes the impact, a white concussive flash that turns mud into spray and spray into vapor. Then, a half-second later, the pressure wave hits your chest like a fist made of air, cracking ribs, bursting eardrums, turning the soft tissue of your lungs into something that no longer works the way it was designed to. Then, after that, the sound. A deep, basso profundo crack that rolls through the Argonne forest and sends every bird in every tree spiraling upward in a panicked cloud of wings. And finally, the silence. The terrible, ringing, blood-warm silence that follows every explosion, in which men look down at their own bodies and try to determine, with whatever clarity they have left, whether they are still alive. On October 4th, 1918, that silence was interrupted by a voice. Major Charles Whittlesey, Wall Street lawyer turned infantry commander, a thin man with wire-frame glasses and a jaw that seemed cut from the granite of the New England mountains where he had grown up, pressed his face into the mud of a French ravine and said very quietly, to no one in particular, "They're killing us. Our own guns are killing us." He was not wrong. The artillery barrage raining down on the ravine known as Charlevoix Mill on a forested hillside, the maps labeled simply as Pocket, was American. The shells were American. The men operating the howitzers were American. They were killing American soldiers, 554 of them, the Lost Battalion, though no one called them that yet. That name would come later, in the newspapers, in the speeches, in the history books written by men who had never smelled the particular combination of black powder, wet, earth, iron blood, and pine sap that defined every moment of life and death in the Argonne forest in the autumn of 1918. For the men in the pocket, there was no name. There was only the mud, the hunger, the wound rot, the thirst, and the shells. American shells. And there was one small, grey-feathered bird sitting in a wicker basket, blinking his amber eyes at the carnage around him, waiting. To understand what Cher Ami did, you have to understand what the Argonne forest was. Not the Argonne forest as it exists today, a peaceful expanse of beech and oak and hornbeam threaded through with hiking trails and memorial plaques, the kind of place where French families take Sunday drives and photograph deer in the golden autumn light. No. The Argonne forest of October 1918 was something else entirely. It was something the soldiers who survived it struggled to describe for the rest of their lives, reaching for words that did not quite exist in English or French or German, because no language had been designed to accommodate what that place had become after 4 years of industrial-scale slaughter. It was approximately 20 kilometers long and 8 kilometers wide, running north to south along the Meuse River in the northeastern corner of France. And by the time the American Expeditionary Forces entered it in September 1918, it had been a contested zone of combat for so long that the forest itself seemed to have absorbed the war, to have metabolized it, to have incorporated the violence into its own biology. The trees had grown around barbed wire until the wire was part of the wood. Shell craters had filled with water and algae, and the particular species of muck that forms only in places where the soil has been repeatedly churned by high explosives and saturated with blood. Unexploded ordnance nested in the leaf litter like toxic eggs. And everywhere, in every direction, at every depth, the forest was threaded through with German defensive positions, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, observation posts, sniper blinds, artillery emplacements, communication trenches, supply routes. The Germans had had 4 years to fortify the Argonne, and they had used every hour of it. They knew every path. They knew every ridgeline. They knew every ravine where water pooled, and where the mud was deepest. They had mapped it, measured it, and turned it into a killing ground of extraordinary sophistication. Into this, in late September 1918, the United States Army sent the 77th Infantry Division. The 77th was not a division of professional soldiers. It was, in the parlance of the time, a National Army Division, which meant it had been assembled from draftees, men pulled from their lives by the machinery of conscription and transformed, with varying degrees of success, into something resembling infantry. The 77th had been drawn primarily from New York City, from the boroughs and neighborhoods and immigrant communities that made the city what it was: Italian Americans from the Bronx, Jewish Americans from the Lower East Side, Irish Americans from Hell's Kitchen, Polish Americans, Greek Americans, Puerto Ricans, men who had come to America from every corner of the Old World and were now being sent back to the Old World to fight and die in a forest most of them had never heard of for reasons most of them only partially understood. They were, as a result, a division of remarkable linguistic diversity. Interpreters within the unit could collectively handle over 24 languages. They were, as another result, a division that had not been fighting long enough to have developed the particular brand of tactical wisdom that comes only from surviving repeated contact with a well-prepared enemy in difficult terrain. They were brave, many of them. They were motivated, most of them. But they were new to this, and the Argonne forest was not a place that was kind to the new. Major Charles Whittlesey was, in almost every respect, the wrong man to lead an infantry battalion in the First World War. He was 34 years old, tall and angular, with the kind of face that looked permanently pensive, as if he were working through a complicated legal argument in his head at all times. He had grown up in Wisconsin, studied at Williams College, gone to Harvard Law School, and established himself as a competent, if not spectacular, attorney at a firm in Manhattan. He was quiet. He was precise. He was the kind of man who read carefully before signing anything, who preferred to solve problems through the careful application of logic rather than the application of force. He wore his glasses in the field when regulations technically discouraged it, because he literally could not function without them. He did not drink. He did not smoke. He did not tell the kind of crude jokes that circulated constantly through the enlisted ranks and that his fellow officers deployed as social lubricant in the exhausted, terrified hours between engagements. He was, by every conventional measure, not a soldier. And yet, by October 1918, Charles Whittlesey had become something that defied the conventional measures. He had become, through the alchemy of sustained crisis, a leader. Not the kind that inspirational posters describe, not the kind that makes speeches or raises fists or leads charges with a pistol in one hand and a flag in the other. The quiet kind, the kind that stays, the kind that, when everything is falling apart and every rational calculation suggests that the correct course of action is to panic or surrender or simply lie down and stop, continues to function, continues to make decisions, continues to look at the men around him and find, in that looking, a reason to persist. On October 2nd, 1918, Whittlesey led his battalion forward through the Argonne as part of a broader American offensive, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, which was the largest military operation in American history up to that point. The plan was straightforward, in the way that plans drawn on maps in warm headquarters always are straightforward. Advance, take ground, push the Germans back. What the plan did not fully account for was that the units on Whittlesey's flanks did not advance as quickly as his own unit, or in some cases did not advance at all, and that as Whittlesey's battalion pushed deeper into German-held territory, the gap between his unit and the units to his left and right grew wider, and then wider still, until the gap was not a gap at all, but a gulf, and the battalion was not advancing into enemy territory so much as it was swimming into it, surrounded on all sides by German forces who were still very much present, very much armed, and very much aware of what had happened. By the morning of October 2nd, The 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry and elements of the 307th Infantry and the 306th Machine Gun Battalion, approximately 554 men in total, were cut off. The Germans had closed behind them. There was no way out. There was no way in. There were no supplies, no ammunition beyond what the men carried, no food beyond the iron rations in their packs, no medical supplies beyond the basic first aid kits each man wore on his belt. And there was, above all, no communication with the outside world, because the telephone wire that connected Whittlesey to his divisional headquarters had been cut, probably in multiple places, by German patrols who understood exactly what they were doing. The pigeons were Whittlesey's last reliable means of communication. He had been given 4 of them at the start of the operation, carried in wicker baskets by the pigeon handlers who accompanied every significant unit in the American Expeditionary Forces, because the Army had learned through painful experience that in the conditions of the Western Front, where wire was cut and radio was unreliable, and runners were killed before they could travel 100 meters, pigeons were often the only thing that worked. A trained carrier pigeon, released in the field, would fly home to its loft with a reliability that no other communication system of the era could match. They navigated by some combination of magnetic fields, visual landmarks, an instinct that science in 1918 could not fully explain, and that science in the 21st century has still not entirely decoded. They flew in rain, they flew in wind, they flew through smoke, they flew through noise that would have paralyzed any human being. They flew, and they arrived, and the messages they carried arrived with them, and in the calculus of the Western Front, this made them worth more per ounce of living flesh than almost anything else the Army possessed. Cher Ami had been part of the American Expeditionary Forces Signal Corps Pigeon Service since his arrival in France in 1918. He was a black-check cock, which is a pigeon fancier's way of saying that his plumage was a dark charcoal grey, with a pattern of darker checkering across his wings and back, the kind of coloration that made him difficult to spot against the grey sky and grey mud of the Western Front. He had been donated to the American war effort by the British Pigeon Service, which had been using carrier pigeons since the beginning of the war, and had accumulated a wealth of experience and expertise that the Americans were still working to match. He had been trained at his home loft, which was now located at the headquarters of the 77th Division, somewhere behind the German lines that surrounded Whittlesey's battalion, roughly 40 kilometers to the northwest of where the men in the pocket were waiting to die. 40 kilometers. On a map, it looks like nothing. In the conditions of the Argonne in October 1918, with German anti-aircraft fire, shrapnel, and the rifles of snipers who had been specifically trained to shoot carrier pigeons, it might as well have been the distance to the moon. By the morning of October 3rd, Whittlesey had already lost 2 of his 4 pigeons. The first had been sent on October 2nd with a message reporting the battalion's position. It had been shot out of the sky almost immediately after release, cut down by German rifle fire before it had climbed 30 meters. The second had been sent with a follow-up message and had suffered the same fate. 2 birds gone, 2 messages lost, and the shells were still falling. The American shells now intermixed with German fire, and the men in the pocket were running out of everything: ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, bandages, morphine, hope. The wounded were piling up in the makeshift aid station that the battalion surgeon, Captain Nelson Holderman, had established in a shallow depression on the hillside, doing what he could with what he had, which was progressively less and less of everything that mattered. Men were dying from wounds that, in a field hospital behind the lines, would have been survivable. They were dying from infection, from blood loss, from the particular kind of slow, mechanical failure that happens when a human body is damaged and then not repaired. And they were dying from American artillery. The 75mm shells from their own guns were hitting the pocket at regular intervals, called in by observers who had imprecise information about where Whittlesey's men actually were, guided by maps that did not match the terrain as it actually existed after years of shelling had rearranged it, and the result was a bombardment that was adding American casualties to the German ones and pushing the total toward a number that Whittlesey, with the careful actuarial mind of a former lawyer, could see was going to become unsurvivable if it did not stop very soon. He had tried everything else. He had sent runners. The first runner sent on October 2nd had been killed within sight of the pocket's perimeter. The second had made it further, perhaps 100 meters into the forest, before the sound of a single rifle shot had ended him. Others had been sent and had not returned, their fates unknown, their messages undelivered. He had tried to signal with mirrors, but the cloud cover was too thick, the canopy too dense. He had tried to set signal fires, but the smoke was indistinguishable from the smoke of the shells that were already falling everywhere. He had run out of options. He had run out of everything except 2 pigeons and whatever remained of his own determination to keep his men alive. The third pigeon was called Omer. Whittlesey's pigeon handler, Private Omar Richards, attached a message to Omer's leg capsule and released him. Omer rose above the tree line, circled once, and then flew in exactly the wrong direction. He was later found at a different loft entirely, having apparently decided that he preferred a different destination. Whittlesey watched him go and said nothing. There was 1 pigeon left. There was Cher Ami. The message Whittlesey dictated for Cher Ami's capsule has become one of the most famous communications of the First World War, both for what it said and for the desperate human reality compressed into its very few words. Whittlesey's adjutant, Lieutenant Arthur McKeer, wrote it out on a small slip of thin paper, the kind designed to be rolled and inserted into the aluminum capsule attached to the bird's leg. The message read, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." That last phrase, "for heaven's sake, stop it," has been analyzed and discussed and quoted for more than a century, and what strikes every person who reads it, even now, is its restraint. Whittlesey was a lawyer. He knew how to choose words. He knew, in the chaos of the pocket, with shells falling and men dying around him, that he had a limited number of words, and that each one had to carry maximum weight. He did not write, "Our men are being massacred by friendly fire." He did not write, "We are dying." He did not write, "Send help immediately, or we will all be dead by morning," though all of those things were true. He wrote, "For heaven's sake, stop it." And in that phrase, there is something that cuts through the century between then and now, something very human and very specific. The tone of a man who has reached the absolute limit of what he can endure and is appealing, not to military protocol or chain of command, but to something more basic, to the simple human recognition that what is happening is wrong and must stop. If you have ever watched something terrible unfold and felt the helpless certainty that it should not be happening, that the people causing it simply do not know that they are causing it and would stop if they only knew, then you understand the emotional register of, "For heaven's sake, stop it." You understand Charles Whittlesey. Private Richards lifted Cher Ami from his basket. The bird was calm. Pigeons often are in the middle of combat, in a way that seems almost supernatural to the human observers around them. They do not appear to process the sounds of battle as signals of danger in the way that humans and most other animals do. They sit and they blink and they wait with a patience that borders on the philosophical. Richards held the bird up and looked at him for a moment, the small weight of feathers and bone and blood and homing instinct in his hands, and then he released him. Cher Ami launched himself upward, wings beating hard against the thick, smoky air of the ravine. He rose above the tree line. He was in the open. He was visible. The German snipers, who had already killed 2 carrier pigeons sent from the same position, saw him immediately. The rifles cracked, The air around the small grey bird filled with the zip and snap of rifle fire, and then the deeper, slower stutter of an MG-08 machine gun, which had been positioned on the high ground to the northeast precisely to cover the airspace above the pocket. The MG-08 fired at a rate of approximately 450 rounds per minute, which works out to 7.5 rounds per second, which is a density of fire that, directed at a single small target, should be mathematically unsurvivable. The men in the pocket watched. Some of them were praying. Some of them were not believers in anything, but they were doing something that looked like prayer anyway, some instinctive reaching toward whatever force in the universe might have any influence over what happened in the next 30 seconds. And then Cher Ami was hit. A burst from the MG-08 connected. The bird tumbled. He dropped out of the sky, falling through the smoke and the cordite haze toward the mud of the forest floor. And the men watching him fall felt the bottom drop out of whatever hope they had left. That was it. That was the last bird. That was the last chance. They were going to die here, under their own artillery, in a French forest, 500 miles from home, and no one was going to know, and the guns were not going to stop, and the morning was going to come, and there would be fewer of them, and then the next morning fewer still, and then there would be none. But Cher Ami did not die. He hit the ground. He lay still for a moment that stretched in the perception of the watching men into something enormous, something that contained within it all the distance between life and death, between rescue and annihilation, between the world where 500 men walked out of the Argonne forest alive and the world where they did not. And then Cher Ami moved. He got up. Not all at once, not smoothly, not in the way that a healthy, uninjured bird gets up when it lands, with a quick ruffle of feathers and an alert turn of the head. He got up the way that a creature gets up when its body has been catastrophically damaged, and the only thing still functioning at full capacity is whatever it is that, in living things, refuses to stop. He was hit in the chest. The bullet had torn through the breast muscles that powered his wings, leaving a wound that, in a human being, would have required immediate surgery, and very likely would have been fatal regardless. One of his eyes was gone, ruptured by shrapnel or a near miss, the socket dark and wet. His right leg was attached to his body by a thread of tissue, a single tendon, nothing more, the bone shattered, the flesh torn, the aluminum message capsule still clipped to it, and swinging with every movement the bird made like the most terrible and important pendant in the world. He tried to fly. The first attempt failed. The second failed. His chest was torn open, and every wing beat drove air through the wound. And the pain, if we can use that word for what a pigeon experiences, must have been something that went beyond anything the word was designed to describe. He tried again. And this time, the wings caught. This time, the feathers found purchase in the cold October air, and Cher Ami rose. Not gracefully, not the way carrier pigeons rise when they are healthy and well-fed and flying in good conditions toward a destination they know. He rose the way a burning building stands for a moment, before it falls, with a terrible, magnificent effort that seems to defy what should be physically possible. He rose above the tree line. He was in the open again. The German guns found him again. More shots. He was still moving, still flying. Blood streaming from the wound in his chest, one leg dangling, one eye gone, navigating by something that was not sight and was not training and was not anything that can be fully explained. He turned northwest. He turned toward home. He began to fly. What happened in the next 25 minutes is known in outline and imagined in detail. We know the distance, approximately 40 kilometers. We know the time. The flight is recorded as having taken approximately 25 minutes, which works out to a speed of roughly 96 kilometers per hour, which is well within the normal range for a carrier pigeon in flight. What we cannot know, and what invites the imagination, is what those 25 minutes were like from the perspective of the bird. We know, from ornithological research done in the century since, that pigeons navigate through a combination of magnetoreception, the ability to sense the Earth's magnetic field and visual landmarks and olfactory cues and possibly other senses that science has not yet fully characterized. We know that this navigational system is extraordinarily robust, capable of functioning even when the bird is injured, even when conditions are poor, even when the environment has been radically altered by the kind of sustained artillery bombardment that had been rearranging the landscape of the Argonne for years. What we do not know, and what we cannot know, is what, if anything, Cher Ami experienced in those 25 minutes. Whether the pain of the chest wound registered as pain in any sense analogous to human suffering. Whether the loss of the eye changed the quality of perception in any way that the bird noticed. Whether the dangling leg, swinging with each wing beat against the capsule that held the message, created any sensation beyond the mechanical disruption of normal flight dynamics. We do not know. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the mystery of what Cher Ami experienced in those 25 minutes above the Argonne is part of what makes the story so persistent, so resistant to being fully told, and therefore fully finished. We keep telling it because we cannot fully imagine it, and we cannot fully imagine it because we are not pigeons and we are not flying through a war zone with a chest wound and a dangling leg and the last hope of 500 men in a canister on what remains of our right leg, and we have never had to navigate by magnetism and instinct through 40 kilometers of shell smoke and October cloud cover on our way to delivering a message that would save lives and become history. We keep telling it because the gap between what we can imagine and what Cher Ami actually did is precisely the size and shape of the thing we call heroism. At the divisional headquarters of the 77th Division, located in a farmhouse several kilometers behind the American lines, the morning of October 4th had been consumed by a growing and deeply uncomfortable awareness that something had gone badly wrong. Reports were fragmentary and contradictory, as reports from the front always were. But what they added up to, when Brigadier General Robert Alexander tried to make sense of them, was that a significant force of American infantry was trapped somewhere in the Argonne, surrounded by German forces, and that the artillery that had been tasked with supporting the broader offensive was possibly hitting them. The possibly was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. It was possible that the American howitzers were on target and hitting German positions. It was possible that they were off target and hitting American positions. It was possible that the coordinate data being used to direct the fire was accurate. It was possible that it was not. Without reliable communication from the unit in question, there was no way to know for certain. And so the guns continued to fire, because the alternative, standing down an artillery barrage in the middle of an offensive on the basis of unconfirmed reports, was a decision that required certainty, and certainty was the one thing the morning had not provided. And then Cher Ami arrived. The pigeon handler on duty at the divisional loft heard him before he saw him. There is a sound a carrier pigeon makes when it arrives at its home loft, a particular wing beat pattern, a particular change in the quality of the air near the landing board, that experienced handlers learn to recognize instantly. This sound was wrong. It was ragged, irregular, the sound of a bird that was not landing so much as it was falling with direction. The handler turned and saw Cher Ami land on the board, and what he saw stopped him for a moment in the way that shocking things stop people, with a sudden sharp clarity that imprints the image permanently on memory. The bird's chest was open, the wound was visible, raw, the breast muscles that had powered 40 kilometers of flight through October air, torn by German rifle fire and still wet with blood. One eye was gone, and the right leg, the leg that bore the message capsule, was attached to the bird's body by a single tendon. Nothing more. The bone shattered and the flesh destroyed, and the leg was swinging with every movement the bird made, and the capsule was still there, still attached, still carrying its cargo. The handler reached for Cher Ami, lifted him carefully from the landing board, and removed the capsule from the leg. Inside was the message in Whittlesey's handwriting, via Makio's pen. We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. The handler ran. He ran to the communications officer. The communications officer ran to the general. The general read the message. The general gave the order. The guns stopped. The silence that followed the cessation of the American artillery barrage is something that the survivors of the lost battalion described for the rest of their lives. Not the absence of sound, because there was still German fire, and there was still the sound of the wounded, and there was still the sound of the forest itself. Wind in the damaged trees, water in the shell craters, the particular ambient hum of a landscape that has absorbed catastrophe and is slowly, almost imperceptibly, adjusting to it. But the American shells were no longer falling. The specific percussive terror of knowing that your own side's ordnance was coming down on your position, that the people trying to kill you included the people who were supposed to be protecting you, was over. And in that particular silence, in that specific cessation, something changed in the pocket, something that is very difficult to name, because it is not the same as hope, exactly, and it is not the same as relief, exactly, but it partakes of both, and it is perhaps best described simply as the return of the possibility of tomorrow. Major Whittlesey heard the American guns stop. He did not know yet whether it meant the message had been received or whether it meant the barrage had simply shifted to another target. But he allowed himself, in that moment, a small and private thing. He closed his eyes behind his wire-frame glasses, and he breathed, just breathed. The rattling, smoky, mud-tasting air of the Argonne, drawn into the lungs of a man who had spent the last 3 days watching people die and refusing to die himself, and breathed out again. The relief of the lost battalion took another 2 days. The fighting was intense. The Germans, recognizing what the trapped American force represented, pressed their advantage, and the men in the pocket continued to take casualties even after the American artillery stopped. Food and ammunition were dropped by American aircraft, some of it falling outside the perimeter and into German hands. More runners were sent, more were killed, but the unit held. Whittlesey held. He moved among his men in the way that the soldiers who survived remembered for decades afterward, quietly, methodically, checking on the wounded, redistributing ammunition, making decisions with the unhurried precision of a man who had accepted that panic was a luxury he could not afford and had simply set it aside. On October 7th, the 77th Division and supporting units finally broke through the German encirclement and reached the pocket. Of the 554 men who had entered the ravine on October 2nd, 194 walked out. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. More than 300 men, more than half of the force that Whittlesey had led into the Argonne forest, gone. The number was brutal. It was the number that Whittlesey carried with him for the rest of his life, a weight that the Congressional Medal of Honor awarded to him at the war's end, and the parades, and the speeches, and the fame that followed him home to New York City never quite managed to offset. Cher Ami survived. This, in the context of everything that happened in the Argonne forest in October 1918, qualifies as something close to miraculous. The Army veterinarians who treated him after his return to the divisional loft found a bird that should not have been alive. The chest wound alone was severe enough to have killed him in flight, should have killed him, according to any reasonable physiological calculation, long before he completed 40 kilometers. The loss of the eye had eliminated half his visual field during navigation. The destruction of the right leg had altered his flight dynamics in ways that the wing muscles should not have been able to compensate for over that distance. And yet he had compensated, and he had navigated, and he had arrived, and the message had been delivered, and 194 men had walked out of the Argonne forest who would not otherwise have done so. The veterinarians carved a small wooden prosthetic leg for him, which he wore for the remainder of his life. General John Pershing himself, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, came to see the bird. The Croix de Guerre, France's highest military decoration, was awarded to Cher Ami, with a gold palm cluster added for the specific action of October 4th. He was the only American pigeon to receive the decoration. When the war ended in November 1918, Cher Ami was transported back to the United States on a ship, traveling in conditions considerably more comfortable than those he had experienced in the Argonne forest. He had become famous. The story of the Lost Battalion had captured the American public's imagination in a way that few individual stories from the war had managed, and at the center of the story, pulling focus even from Whittlesey and his extraordinary leadership, was the grey pigeon who had flown 40 kilometers with a chest wound and a dangling leg and had delivered the message that stopped the guns. Cher Ami died on June 13th, 1919, less than a year after his famous flight. The cause of death was recorded as the wounds he had sustained in combat, which had never fully healed and had gradually compromised his health over the 8 months he had spent as a celebrity and a symbol. He was mounted by a taxidermist and donated to the Smithsonian Institution, where he is displayed to this day in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. The small wooden prosthetic leg is preserved separately and displayed alongside him. He is still there. You can go and see him. What does it mean, 106 years later, to think about Cher Ami? The easy answer, the one that the newspaper articles and the children's books and the commemorative plaques reach for, is heroism, a hero, a war hero, a tiny hero who did a large thing. And that is not wrong, exactly, but it does not quite reach what the story is actually about, or at least not all of what it is about, because Cher Ami did not choose to fly. He did not understand the message in his capsule. He did not know about the Lost Battalion or the 75mm shells or Major Whittlesey's wireframe glasses or the 194 men who would walk out of the forest. He flew because he was trained to fly, because the homing instinct that pigeon breeders had spent decades selecting and refining in his lineage pointed him toward his loft with a fidelity that his wounds and the German fire and the October air could not completely overcome. He was not a hero in the sense that he chose to be one. He was a hero in the sense that when everything that was in him was tested, what was in him was enough. And there is something in that distinction that matters, because the same is true of Whittlesey, who was not, by his own account, a soldier, and who did not choose to be tested in the way that he was tested, but who, when he was tested, discovered that what was in him was also enough. And the same is true of the 194 men who walked out of the Argonne forest, most of whom would have told you, if you had asked them before October 2nd, 1918, that they were not heroes, that they were just men, draftees, New Yorkers, kids from Brooklyn and the Bronx and the Lower East Side, who had been pulled out of their lives and handed a rifle and sent to France. They did not choose what they found in themselves in the pocket, but what they found was there. And that is perhaps the truest thing the story of Cher Ami tells us, that what we need, when we need it most, may already be inside us, waiting, the way the homing instinct waited inside one gray-feathered bird for the moment when the sky was full of bullets and the guns were falling on the wrong people and there was no one else left to deliver the message. We do not know we have it until the moment when we need it. We do not know we are capable of it until the moment when the capsule is attached and we are released and there is 40 kilometers of shot-through October sky between us and the place where we need to be. Cher Ami did not know he could fly through that. He just flew, and that is the whole story. And it is enough. Charles Whittlesey returned to New York City in the spring of 1919 as a certified American hero. The newspapers put his photograph on the front page. There were parades, there were dinners, ceremonies, speeches, handshakes, the full apparatus of public gratitude that a grateful nation deploys toward the men it sends to do its fighting and then needs to celebrate when they survive. Whittlesey received the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was promoted. He was photographed. He gave speeches about courage and duty and the American character, and he gave them well because he was a lawyer and he knew how to speak in public, how to find the right words, how to make a crowd feel the thing you wanted them to feel. He was very good at performing the role of the hero that the public needed him to be. And underneath the performance, something was breaking. The men who knew him in those years, who saw him at the firm where he returned to practice law, who encountered him at the veterans' organizations he joined and eventually led, noticed a quality in him that they could not quite name. A distance, a preoccupation, a sense that some part of him was still in the pocket, still counting the men, still doing the arithmetic that came out to more than 300 dead. He did not talk about the war in private the way he talked about it in public. In private, when he talked about it at all, he talked about the men he had lost. He remembered them individually, by name, by face, by the specific way they had died or disappeared. He carried them with him in a way that the Medal of Honor and the parades and the civilian life he was trying to reconstruct could not displace. On November 26, 1921, Charles Whittlesey boarded a passenger ship, the SS Toloa, bound for Havana, Cuba. He was traveling, his friends thought, for rest, for a break from the city and the demands of the practice and the memorial ceremonies that the veterans' organizations had been organizing with increasing frequency as the third anniversary of the war's end approached. On the morning of November 27th, somewhere in the waters between the Florida coast and Cuba, he went overboard. His body was never recovered. He was 41 years old. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was nothing except the absence of the man and the sea and the particular silence that surrounds a story when the story does not have an ending that feels like an ending. Whittlesey is buried, in the symbolic sense, in a memorial in his hometown of Pittsfield, Massachusetts, because there is no body and no grave. He is remembered by historians and veterans advocates and the people who care about the First World War. He is remembered by the story of the Lost Battalion, which is always, ultimately, also his story. And he is remembered, perhaps most accurately and most honestly, as a man who gave everything he had to his men in the pocket, who found in himself, in those terrible days, more than he or anyone else had known was there, and who carried the cost of that discovery for the 3 years he survived the war, until he could not carry it anymore. He was not a simple hero. He was a human being, and human beings are not designed to survive what Charles Whittlesey survived without being changed by it in ways that do not always lead somewhere livable. The story of the Lost Battalion became, in the years immediately following the war, one of the defining American narratives of the First World War. A film was made of it in 1919, while the events were still fresh, a silent film with title cards and the jerky, overlit aesthetic of early cinema, featuring actors playing Whittlesey and his men in recreations of the scenes in the pocket. The film was a commercial success. It played in theaters across America to audiences that were, in many cases, composed of veterans and their families, people who had their own version of the war to compare against the dramatized version on the screen. The film did not show Cher Ami. The technology of the time and the budgetary constraints of the production made the Pigeon's flight difficult to dramatize in a way that would have been cinematically satisfying. But Cher Ami was in the story anyway, in the bones of it, the structural necessity that the narrative required, the last bird, the last chance, the flight through the fire. You cannot tell the story of the Lost Battalion without Cher Ami, because Cher Ami is what the story is about. The battalion was lost, and then it was found, and what found it was a bird with a chest wound and a dangling leg, who flew 40 kilometers, because that is what he was built to do. Take Cher Ami out of the story, and the Lost Battalion is just a tragedy. 500 men trapped and killed in a forest. Put Cher Ami back in, and the story becomes something else, something that the human mind wants and needs stories to be. A test, a moment of crisis, a figure who meets the crisis in a way that exceeds reasonable expectation, and a consequence, a result, a world that is different, because the moment was met. The 77th Division's Pigeon service continued to operate through the end of the war, which came on November 11th, 1918, a little more than a month after Cher Ami's flight. In that month, other pigeons flew other messages, other missions were accomplished or failed, other moments of crisis were navigated with the tools available, which were always insufficient and always somehow enough. The pigeon handlers, the men who carried the birds and cared for them and released them and waited to see whether they would return, received relatively little recognition for their work. They were, in the military hierarchy of the AEF, a specialized technical service, not infantry, not artillery, not the kinds of soldiers who got credited with taking ground or holding positions. They were the people who kept the communication system functioning, and communication systems, like all infrastructure, are most visible when they fail. When the pigeons did not arrive, when the messages were lost, when the chain of command broke down because the links connecting it were shot out of the sky, everyone knew. When the pigeons did arrive, when the messages got through, when the connection held, it was simply what was supposed to happen. Cher Ami was the exception to this pattern, the case in which the success of the communication system was spectacular enough, and the story attached to it compelling enough to break through the invisibility that normally surrounded the service. He became famous so that the people who made him possible would not be entirely forgotten. The Smithsonian's display of Cher Ami is in the National Museum of American History on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. If you stand in front of the case and look at him, what you see is a taxidermied bird, gray-feathered, glass-eyed, posed in something approximating a natural resting position. He is smaller than most people expect. Carrier pigeons are not large birds. Cher Ami in life weighed perhaps 100 grams, roughly the weight of 2 large eggs. The chest wound is visible, or was at the time of mounting, though preservation has obscured some of the physical damage over the more than a century since his death. The right leg is gone, replaced by the small wooden prosthetic. The left eye socket is dark. He looks, for a taxidermied animal in a museum case, remarkably intact, remarkably preserved. And this, too, is a kind of story. The decision someone made in 1919 to ensure that he would be preserved, that the physical evidence of what he had done would be maintained, that a century later people would be able to stand in front of a glass case on the National Mall and look at the actual bird, the actual animal that had actually flown those 40 kilometers with those actual wounds. Not a replica, not a model, him. There is something about that specificity, that insistence on the physical reality of the thing, that matters. We tell stories, and we build memorials, and we name streets and ships and military units after the heroes we want to remember. All of that is good and necessary, but sometimes the most honest memorial is the thing itself, the bird, the wound, the leg hanging by a thread, the message delivered. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, of which the story of the Lost Battalion was one small part, lasted 47 days, from September 26th to November 11th, 1918. It involved more than 1 million American soldiers, roughly a quarter of the entire American expeditionary forces at their peak strength. American casualties during the offensive were approximately 26,000 killed and over 95,000 wounded, making it the deadliest military engagement in American history, surpassing even the bloodiest battles of the Civil War in terms of total American losses over a comparable period. The Argonne forest sector alone accounted for a significant portion of those casualties, and the fighting there was, by the accounts of the men who participated in it, among the most brutal and disorienting of the entire Western Front, which is saying something significant given the general level of brutality and disorientation that characterized the Western Front as a whole. Into this context, the story of Cher Ami and the Lost Battalion has always been a story of the specific within the overwhelming. The numbers of the Meuse-Argonne offensive are so large that they become, for the human mind, essentially abstract. 26,000 dead, 95,000 wounded, 1 million men, 47 days. The numbers are real. Each one of them corresponds to a specific person whose specific death or injury was specific and terrible. But the mind cannot hold that specificity at the scale of 100,000. It can hold 554. It can hold the names Whittlesey, Richards, Holderman. It can hold Cher Ami. And through the specific, through the story of one man and one bird and one message delivered against every reasonable expectation, the larger catastrophe becomes something that the mind can approach, can touch at its edges, can begin to comprehend. That is what stories do. Not explain the incomprehensible, but provide a way in, a particular angle of approach, a door cut in the wall of abstraction through which we can, at least briefly, see the thing as it actually was. Specific, physical, felt. Think about the people in your own life who have done the equivalent of that flight, who have taken the hit and kept going, who have lost something essential along the way, vision or certainty, or the comfortable assumption that the world will not hurt them, and have kept moving anyway, not because they knew they would make it, but because the destination was real, and the message was important, and there was no one else. Those people are around you. They may not have a croix de guerre or a display case in the Smithsonian. They probably do not, but they flew 40 kilometers on a ruined body because someone needed the message delivered, and they delivered it. If this story moved you, if Cher Ami and Whittlesey and the men of the Lost Battalion found something in you that you were not expecting them to find, then leave a comment below. Tell me who your Cher Ami is. Tell me about the person in your life who took the hit and kept flying. Because those stories deserve to be told too, and this channel exists to tell them, and we are only just getting started. The history of the people who refuse to stop is longer than any war, and we are going to spend a very long time together exploring it.